Honestly, no one would believe this story, except it's actually true. In 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying 2 live nuclear bombs was conducting a very covert airborne alert mission when the pilot got on the radio and told the entire crew to abandon the plane because it was going down. The plane ultimately caught fire and exploded, dropping 2 live thermonuclear warheads between the towns of Goldsboro and Faro, North Carolina. These bombs are used to crush cities. They're 25 times stronger than the ones we used in Hiroshima. Each bomb has 4 safety mechanisms before it detonates. On the bomb recovered, 3 of those safety mechanisms were activated, meaning only a single switch kept the bomb from detonating. And the second bomb is still in the swamps of North Carolina.
This is why you should never watch my videos before going to bed. In 1986, a young girl opens her closet to find a man wearing a dress and holding an axe. He grabs her and ties her up, and then walks around the house and does the same thing to the rest of her family. While the guy is ransacking their house, one of the kids breaks free, runs next door, and tells his neighbor. The neighbor calls the cops show up, the family's saved, but the guy is nowhere to be found. The family leaves the house and stays with relatives in hopes that they'll catch this guy before they have to go back. But after a few weeks, they haven't caught him, there aren't any leads, and they say, you know what, we'll go back to our house anyways. As the family's pulling back into their driveway, the father looks up at one of the windows and sees for a split second the head of the man with the dress in their bedroom. They call the police, who go in and find pennies glued to the ceiling and weird writing all over the house, but they can't find this crazy guy. Until one of the officers found a secret crawl space in the basement, where psychotic killer Danny LaPlante had been living for 2 months. This story has the best ending ever. In 2003, a 9-year-old was home alone playing video games when he thinks he hears his cat meowing on the back patio, so he goes downstairs to let him in. He sees a deranged-looking man standing on his back patio howling at the sky, who then quickly looks at the boy. He grabs a fistful of cigarette butts from the ashtray, stuffs them in his mouth before he starts howling at the sky some more. After the police take the man away, they come back to talk to the boy and his family. Turns out the man had severe autism and lived in that boy's house up until his mother passed away, at which time he was transitioned to a mental institution. He broke out of that mental institution to go looking for his mom, which is how he came back to the boy's house. 15 years later, that same boy is sitting on his same back patio when he starts to hear that same meowing sound, and he looks up and it's the same autistic man walking towards his house. Knowing the man's story, he invites him into his house. The man's face lights up, he runs inside and starts crying. He was finally home. The men become friends, and every week Tom goes home to visit. This is what they meant when they said, don't talk to strangers. In the early 1900s, a 10-year-old boy was playing in the woods when a tall man appeared and asked if he wanted to come back to his cabin for dinner. Totally caught off guard, the boy reluctantly agrees and begins walking. When they get to the cabin, the boy is relieved when he sees Paul, a family friend, sitting on the porch, so the boy happily goes inside. After they eat, the boy says thank you to the strange tall man, says bye to Paul, and then he leaves. He had only walked a few steps when he sees his family, along with Paul, running up the path towards him, frantically asking if he was okay. Confused, the boy says, I'm just fine, and he looks at Paul and he's like, why didn't you tell them I was with you at the cabin? And he points over his shoulder. Paul glances over the boy's shoulder and then narrows his eyes and says, you were kidnapped by a cult 3 days ago. No one's seen you. Terrified, the boy turns around to look at the cabin he just came from, and it's gone. All he sees is a dark forest that stretches for miles. Don't read the comments, it will spoil the very satisfying ending. In 1999, a 20-year-old kid was obsessed with this 16-year-old girl, but she wasn't into him. Frustrated, he breaks into her house and demands that she dates him. When she refuses, he kills her. And then he kills her 14-year-old sister too. Or so he thought. The 14-year-old survived and easily identified Paul Powell as the killer. Powell showed no remorse in court and even called the victim stupid. When he was sentenced to death, though, his attitude changed and he cried and begged for mercy. And unfortunately, mercy would come in the form of a legal loophole that switched his death sentence to a life sentence. Believing he was safe from the death penalty because of double jeopardy, he wrote this ridiculous letter to the prosecuting attorney, basically admitting to every single detail of the crime, kind of bragging about what he got away with. So the attorney just takes the letter, gives it to a judge. The judge looks at it and says, yep, there's new evidence here, orders a new trial, and immediately this dude is resentenced to death. And a few months later, this lowlife was executed. Sometimes monsters are real. After his parents fell asleep at night, a 9-year-old would sneak downstairs into the kitchen and crush junk food. One night, as he's making his way downstairs, he swears he can hear someone in the kitchen, but his whole family's upstairs asleep. He peeks his head around the corner, and in the kitchen is this skinny man drinking milk straight from the carton with his back turned. The boy's terrified, sprints upstairs, tells his parents, who come right downstairs, they can't find anything. It looks like no one's been in the kitchen. And they ultimately blame their son, and they say your imagination's just playing tricks on you. The kid knows what he saw, and for the next few days, he felt like everywhere he went in the house, he was being watched. Then one night, he's laying in bed looking at the vent on his ceiling, and he sees a pair of eyes looking down at him. Freaks out, runs to his parents, who come in, look everywhere, find nothing, and blame him again. A couple of weeks go by, and the boy starts to notice a terrible smell coming out of the vent on his ceiling. He convinces his parents to come in and actually cut into the ceiling and go look around, and they find that skinny man, and he's dead. If you're alone right now, don't watch this video. In the winter of 2018, a man who was living alone in the mountains wakes up to find a red ball sitting on his front yard. He assumed the only neighbor he had must have kids, and so he kicks the ball over the fence, goes inside, doesn't think anything of it. That night, he wakes up to the sound of kids laughing outside of his window. He goes outside to check on them because it's the middle of the night, and there's no kids anywhere, but that red ball is back on his property. So he picks it up, brings it in his house, and goes back to bed. The next morning, he goes over to his neighbor's house to let them know that their kids were out in his yard in the middle of the night. But it turns out his neighbor is just some old man who lives alone, and there aren't any kids anywhere in the area. That night, he wakes up again to the sound of kids on his property, and when he looks outside, there's no kids, but that red ball is back on his property. Panicked, he runs downstairs to make sure the one he brought in is still inside, and it's gone. He checked every window and door, and everything was still locked. It didn't make any sense. He decides to look out the window one more time, and off in the distance is some weird, stiff figure watching. This is why you always say yes to tandoori chicken. In 2012, a high school tutor and her student stayed up so late one night studying that by the time they were done, the buses had stopped running. Without another way home, the student asked if he could stay the night at her place. Reluctantly, she agreed. When they got back to the apartment, she fell asleep on her bed and he fell asleep on a blanket next to her bed on the ground. A few hours later, she wakes up to the boy standing awkwardly in the middle of the room with a very strange look on his face. She asks him, "What's wrong?" He looks at her and says, "I'm really hungry. Let's go get some tandoori chicken." Confused, she says, "It's 2 a.m. Just get a snack in the cupboard." And he grabs her by the arm and he says, "No, we are getting tandoori chicken right now." And he yanks her from the bed. Feeling totally caught off guard by this whole situation, she goes into the hall with the boy, and as soon as the door shuts behind them, she can tell that he is terrified. He looks at her and just says, "I'm not actually hungry. When I woke up, there was someone under your bed." Let this be a reminder that there really are monsters out there. In 2007, a woman living right near a prison in California got home late one night and went right to bed. Around midnight, she woke up to footsteps on her first floor, assumed it was her roommate, so she goes downstairs to say hi. She yells out to her roommate, who doesn't say anything, and then in walks this giant man who she doesn't recognize. She runs upstairs, jumps in her closet into the crawl space, and hides. As she's helplessly tucked away in this little crawl space, trying not to make any sound, all she hears is this giant man sprinting around her house, running into walls, flipping furniture, and screaming in frustration because he can't find her. Finally, after several hours, she slowly opens the crawl space back up, crawls out, and gets her phone off the nightstand and calls police. As she's telling the police her story, she describes the person who had broken in, and they stop her and say, "Ma'am, go back in the crawl space and stay there. We'll be there as soon as we can." It turned out a 6'11" convicted murderer had escaped the prison and was still on the loose. This is why you should always watch videos to the end. In 2003, a woman came home to her apartment to see that her door was unlocked. She went inside, nothing was missing, so she assumed she must have left it open. When it happened a few more times, but still nothing was missing in her apartment, she went out and got a camera, set it up in her apartment aimed at the front door. The next day, her door was unlocked, so she reviewed the footage. She watches in horror as late in the night, her front door opens and in walks this tall, creepy man who looks around and then walks towards her bedroom off camera. She immediately sprints out of her apartment and calls the police, who show up and tell her to go back in her apartment and just try to stay calm, and that they would put an officer right outside her door so she's safe. As she's sitting on the bed, totally traumatized, she realizes something. She only saw him enter her apartment on that video. She doesn't know if he actually left. As she's sitting there, she feels breathing on her ankles. She runs out, the cop comes in, and he finds the tall, creepy man under the bed holding a knife and a camera. These are pretty cool, but it's the plot twist at the end that's gonna get you. You wake up stranded on a deserted island, and now you need to go find drinkable water. So where are some places we can find that? You look around the island and you notice a whole bunch of coconut trees, and you think, well, people drink coconut water, I'll just drink that until I get rescued. Except if you only drink coconut water and don't supplement it with another water source, you will develop wicked diarrhea and will die of dehydration. So you start looking for an alternative source of water. And you remember from that documentary about cannibals that it is safe to drink your own blood. So you cut your arm open, you start drinking your own blood, but what you failed to understand is only in small doses is that okay. Beyond a couple teaspoons, and you'll develop something called hemochromatosis, which results in your lungs filling with fluid, and you basically drown from the inside out. When you finish this video, you're gonna Google 3 words. In 2014, a German man and his friends went on vacation to a seaside resort in Bulgaria. On the last day of his trip, he got in a fight with 4 other guys over a soccer match, leaving him with a perforated eardrum. A doctor prescribes him an antibiotic and advises him not to fly home the next day with his friends because a change in air pressure could further damage his eardrum. So, his friends take off the next day and he decides to stay one more night and checks into a cheap hotel. That night, his mother gets a distressing phone call from him where in a low whisper he says that 4 men are coming to kill him and that she should cancel all of his bank cards. Footage from that night in the hotel shows him pacing up and down the hallway and even hiding in an elevator. Early the next day, he heads to the airport, but before he goes through security, he does something truly unexplainable that was captured on camera and has been viewed millions of times across the internet. He stops, drops all of his things, turns around and sprints out of the airport yelling, "I don't want to die here," climbs a barbed wire fence, disappears into the forest, never to be seen again. Be careful what you put in your body. In 2014, a couple returned to their home to find it trashed in baffling ways. There was lotion all over the door handles, all of their shoes had had their soles ripped off of them, and someone had dumped an entire can of paint all over the toilet. Despite the obvious break-in, the police come and can't find any evidence of theft, so they leave thinking the couple's not in danger anymore. That night, the couple hears scratching underneath their bed and what sounds like a crying animal. Not wanting to find out what it was, they leave and call the cops, who come right back and start investigating the house, and they make a startling discovery in their bedroom. Wedged underneath the couple's bed was this 90-pound tiny little woman carrying a huge butcher's knife and a hypodermic needle. As they're taking this crazy lady away in handcuffs, one of the officers comes over to the couple and is like, "So she was high on meth, and for at least 2 hours, she had been burrowing a hole in the underside of your mattress with that knife to get to you." Most people believe these 3 things will save your life. They don't. Let's pretend that you're on vacation with some friends in this cabin, and you hear on the news that there's actually a killer on the loose in the woods surrounding your cabin. What do? Instinctively, you're gonna wanna ditch your friends and just start running into the woods. No shoes, no weapons, no cell phone, no sense of where you're going. But that's actually a terrible idea because the killer is in the woods, and you'd be putting yourself more in harm's way, not less. So you decide to stay put, and then you remember that your friend drove you all to the cabin in their brand new Lamborghini that was working like 5 minutes ago. So why can't you just pile into that and drive away to safety? The problem with that is anytime you're in a cabin in the woods and there's a killer on the loose around your cabin, even if it's a brand new car, it's not gonna start. So don't even go out and try it. You're just sitting in the cabin doing nothing when all of a sudden you feel like someone could be watching you and you wanna turn around and make sure no one is. Don't turn around, because if you do, the killer will magically appear behind you. If you make it to the end, I'm sorry. In 2007, a woman was lying awake in her hotel bed when she started hearing a kid run up and down the hall laughing and making tons of noise. She considered going out and telling the kid to be quiet, but eventually just said whatever and fell asleep. The next morning, she got up and asked her teenage daughter, who was staying in the room next door, if she had heard the kid, and she said yes, it was so annoying. That night, the woman is back in bed trying to sleep when once again she hears the kid in the hall. Now feeling pretty annoyed herself, she starts walking to the front door to get a better listen when the footsteps stop right in front of her door and she hears the kid playing with the do not disturb sign. She leans into the peephole to get a better look, but the kid's gone. So she steps into the hallway and looks down. There is no way you can predict the ending to this one. In 1900, a man arrived on a little island off the coast of Scotland to relieve one of the 3 lighthouse workers that was there. As he neared the lighthouse, he saw the iron railings had been folded and ripped out of the concrete, and a big boulder that sat out front had moved. When he reached the lighthouse, the door was open, and inside there were half-eaten bowls of food sitting on the table, chairs flipped over, no sign of the 3 men, but there was one clue: their logbook. In the last few entries of the logbook, one of the men describes the winds outside as being more severe than anything he's seen in 20 years. He also says they've been crying and praying for the storm to stop. But why would 3 highly experienced lighthouse workers that have probably ridden out dozens of bad storms before, and they were in a brand new lighthouse that was considered safe, be crying and praying for this particular storm to end? The very last thing they wrote before they disappeared without a trace was, "Storm ended, sea is calm, God is over all." Except here's the problem: there was never any storm anywhere near their island that week. This is why you should never spend the night on Niku Island. In 1937, while on her flight around the world, Amelia Earhart mysteriously vanished over Howland Island in the Pacific Ocean. Despite an enormous search, she was never found. 3 years after her disappearance, a scientist discovered an incomplete skeleton on this tiny, uninhabited island called Niku Island that wasn't too far from Howland Island. It looked like whoever's bones these were, they had been ripped limb from limb. But when the bones were examined, they determined they were not Amelia Earhart's. But in 2017, a forensic anthropologist re-examined the bones and determined they were almost definitely Amelia's. So scientists went to Niku Island and they found freckle cream, something Amelia was famous for using. So the working theory is she crash-landed on Niku Island and she fell asleep somewhere on the beach. Then, after smelling her blood, hundreds of 3-foot-wide coconut crabs came out of their burrows, swarmed her, and ate her.
Can you imagine being locked inside your house for your whole life? Caroline's aunt and uncle said she was so ugly that she had to be hidden from the world. If anyone saw her, she'd be taken to the church and burned at the stake. But things are not as they seem. One day, Caroline started asking questions. She wanted to know why the other kids could play outside, but she could only sit and look out from her bedroom window. This made her aunt and uncle very angry. They said, "Can't you see yourself? Don't you understand the sacrifices we've had to make to keep you hidden from the world?" She had been convinced that staying trapped was for her own good, but one day she decided to escape. She used a safety pin to unlock the door and left. However, soon after she made it out, 2 men wearing uniforms started shouting at her. She began running.
This is why you should always change your locks. In 2017, a college girl woke up from a nightmare drenched in sweat and decided to rinse off before going back to sleep. She propped her phone on a shelf, turned on some music, and then hopped in the shower. A few minutes later, she reaches for her phone to change the song, but stops suddenly. Reflected on her phone's screen was a person standing in the middle of her bathroom facing the shower. She somehow kept her composure, turned the water to scalding hot, and then ripped open the curtain and sprayed the intruder in the face. As they howled in pain, she ran past them to her kitchen to get her butcher's knife. In a panic, she can't find her knife, so she just runs out of the apartment and calls the police. The police go in and come out with a crazy-looking woman in handcuffs. One of the officers comes over to the girl and says she used to live here and she had copies of your keys. Then he pauses and looks down and brings up a clear evidence bag that contained her butcher's knife, and he says, "Looks like she wanted her apartment back."
I'm not scared, I already know. You're not there, just let me go. Did I let you in my heart too soon? Now I know I wasn't right for you. Leave me lying here. Don't want you to see me crying these tears. I'll house.
Have you let anyone borrow your phone before? One woman let her son borrow her phone, but she could have never expected the terrifying things she saw after she got her phone back. So this woman got her new phone and she put it on the kitchen counter and went to watch some TV. That's when her son came in and asked if he could borrow the phone to play with it. The woman didn't think much of it at first, so she agreed, but she could have never known that this would lead to a terrifying discovery. When it was nighttime, she got ready to tuck her son into bed, so she went upstairs to his room, but he wasn't there. Then she ran over to her room and saw him sleeping on her bed with the new phone in his hand. She felt relieved, so she took her phone back and started looking through it. At first, nothing was out of the ordinary. She saw her background had changed, but it wasn't until she saw the photos that she found the horrifying surprise. There were many new photos on her phone that her son took around the house, the front door, the kitchen, and even photos of her taken from the back when she was watching TV. She started deleting these photos until the last one caught her eye. Instantly, she turned around, terrified. It was a photo of her son sleeping in her bed, but it was taken by someone else, someone standing above him, and on the edge of the photo was half of a stranger's face.
This is why you should be very careful who you talk to online. A 16-year-old girl was home with her mom when she got a disturbing text message from a boy she had recently met on Snapchat. He told her he was right outside of her house, but when she went to look, no one was there. Frightened, she decides to sleep in her mom's room that night, and right before she goes to bed, she gets another text from the boy that just says, "I'm in your house." She shows her mom, who immediately searches the whole house, checks every door, turns on every light. There's no one there. So even though they're creeped out, they go back to bed. The next morning, she gets up and she goes back to her bedroom and immediately feels like she's being watched. She checks in her closet, looks behind her door, there's no one there. Then she noticed that the shoe boxes she normally kept perfectly arranged next to her bed had been moved. So she crouches down to put them back in order, and then out of the corner of her eye, she notices something. The boy who was texting her